Those of you who've encountered me before will know that I don't use slides. This all stems from a lecture at the LSE about a couple of years ago where the Deputy Governor of the ECB, Vito Costancio, gave a half-hour lecture without slides. And I realised that when he wasn't using slides, everybody listened to what he was saying rather than gazing at the slides. So I don't use slides unless I've got a nice chart or something to show you, which on this occasion I haven't, because I'm not here to talk about charts, except as communication devices. Charts are wonderful things, pictures are wonderful things. But on this occasion, I think they would muddy the waters somewhat. I think I want to talk about how it is that economists are perceived and how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive our relationship with the public. Because I think at the heart of understanding how we can communicate is kind of understanding that relationship. And I mean, it's become apparent to me, Tony will probably throw brickbats at me in a minute, that there certainly has been a perception in some parts of the public that economists are kind of somewhat detached from reality, that they can come up with all these wonderful research full of lots of lovely Greek formulas and lots of figures and statistics and charts, and using representative agents, and people look at those, if they come across them at all, look at them and say, what's that got to do with me? It's all too easy to think that all we need to do is communicate the outcome of our research and that everybody will understand it and that they will identify with it and they'll take it on board and think and understand what relevance that has to them. And I think in the course of the work that I've been doing now over however long it is, 6 or 7 years, that it's immensely important actually not to assume that people understand even the basics of what you're talking about, right? It's really quite fundamental things that we tend to take for granted that people know, and actually the vast majority of them don't. And so I think one really important thing when we're communicating, trying to communicate some really difficult stuff, I think, to people, and things that actually many of them don't want to hear, because it doesn't fit with their framing, it doesn't fit with what they want to believe, it doesn't fit with what they've believed all their lives, is actually, firstly, to be completely honest with them and not try to fudge anything. I had, earlier this afternoon, I sneaked out for a bit and met somebody from the Economics Foundation to talk about, as it happens, their ideas for a network of regional banks, which they are sort of framing as a break-up of RBS. And I said to him, look, if what you want to do is break up RBS and put it into resolution, then say so. Don't try and fudge this by making it we can convert RBS into this, because the reality is you can't. And there are literally millions of retail customers out there who would be very, very affected by any such proposal, and they need to know where they stand. So I think that's the first thing I would say. I don't particularly wish to have a go at Neff about this, but I think sometimes we can all be guilty of being less than clear with people about exactly what the deal is, what the situation is, and what it means for them. And that, I think, brings me to my second point, and this is probably where Liam will throw brickbats at me, that when we're writing about things as economists, it's awfully easy to, in a way, to be quite academic and quite dry about it and detach it from real lives. I made myself read the Daily Mail recently. No, it's a little bit of a story, actually, because I was hiding out in the service station at Medway Services, because I have a lot of pressures on me at the moment in lots of directions, so I was finding half an hour of me time. While I was sitting in the service area at Medway Services, I had a cup of coffee and I wanted a newspaper, and you can borrow newspapers there. But on that occasion, the only ones they had were the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and which was not a great choice. And I looked at them and thought, well, I diss the Daily Mail a lot, I criticise it a lot, and I don't read it. So if I'm going to criticise something, I really need to read it. So I picked it up and I read it. And yeah, there are things in there that I think, oh, that's rubbish. Yeah, we would all do that. But I think what really came home to me, and the reason why their message is so powerful and sometimes ours doesn't get through, is that all the time throughout the paper they are talking about people. They're talking about ordinary people and people's lives. There are individual stories there. There are a lot of sob stories there. There was a whole page about something awful that was happening in the NHS about patients with dementia being kicked out in the middle of the night and sent back to their homes to sit in the dark. And they had individual stories there. And that connects with people, and people can relate it to their own lives and their own experiences, and they understand that. So the challenge for us, I think, is to say, okay, we've got this wonderful research, but how can we relate that to people's lives? And so when we pick up an academic paper, and there's lots of lovely stuff in there. I mentioned representative agents just now, but real people aren't representative agents. It may be that when we're communicating the contents of a research paper, rather than the paper itself, but the way we get the message out, is actually to talk about people's lives, the power of anecdote, and the way in which what it means for individual people's lives. So, for example, rather than talking about the effect on GDP of Brexit, maybe we do need to be talking much more about not just living standards, but living standards for particular sectors of the economy and particular people, particular groups. I know we do this to some extent, but maybe we need to do more of it. Maybe we need to be a bit more Daily Mail in how we, I know you're wincing over there, a bit more Daily Mail in how we communicate what we're trying to communicate. So that would be the first thing I would say about communicating economic ideas in a way that actually connects with people and doesn't assume that they know things that they don't, or that they are interested in kind of up their things when they're down here worrying about how they're going to pay for their elderly care and how they're going to look after their dad, and they've got a lot of pressures on them and what that's going to mean for them. And I think it's these kind of things that are a way of getting across to people. Moving on a bit, I also want to talk a little bit about not just what we communicate, but also how. Because, again, we tend to sort of communicate in particular ways, don't we? We produce research papers and we write articles in the FT. Perhaps less often in places that the ordinary public read. I do a lot with social media. And it is a fact that social media is an extremely powerful way of getting messages out there. We actually have a president who announces policy on Twitter. And everybody now is watching Donald Trump's Twitter feed, right? Because that's where he makes his policy announcements. He actually put a whole post on Facebook about something, right? He's bypassing the mainstream media. So our media channels, the way in which we get our messages out there is changing, and we need to be aware of other ways of communicating things. There are huge pitfalls with social media. It's not as it was when it started, when it was this nice sort of friendly place where you could just sort of share a virtual cup of tea and a biscuit and have a chat about banking, which is how it was when I first joined it. Now it's heavily siloed, that there are vested interests on social media who drive the agenda and drum up followers, and those followers talk to each other and actively conspire to silence or freeze out people whose views don't conform with theirs. And I think one of the things that makes it very difficult for people who are presenting perhaps a rather uncomfortable message to be heard. And so one of the challenges we face is actually getting our message heard at all, given the way in which these kind of very powerful new media are becoming siloed. So I was thinking how the heck do we deal with this? Because it is a huge problem. And I think that in a way perhaps we need to be a bit more canny about finding who the influencers are. and saying, rather than just saying, right, we can produce an academic paper and write a piece about it and put it out there on social media, but actually think about who we need to influence, and some of those people might be people that we kind of go, ugh, about. No, Nigel Farage. Because if those people are spreading economic information that's actually wrong and actually harmful to their own followers, to their own people, then in a way we have failed in our communication duty. We have to influence the influencers. Angus has given me 2 minutes, so those are some thoughts for you. So to leave it there, but I guess I would sum up by saying that we need a much more, I hate to say it, populist touch in the way in which we communicate our ideas and our information. And we need to be thinking about who it is who influences and how we can influence them.